What if you could go back in history and have a conversation with someone that you had only heard about or read about? There are many people that come to mind, and I could probably strike up a conversation and love to chat with several dozen people. But one person in particular I think about, and I only missed him by 1 year. His name was Francis Lester Simpson, my grandfather. He died on July 4th, 1959, 1 year before I was born. Lester Simpson was born in McNairy County, Tennessee in 1893. He married my grandmother, Ruth Webb, from Whiteville, Tennessee in 1910. I was sitting at a doctor's office in Memphis for a regular checkup. I think I'd pulled out my cell phone. I was just checking my email, and I noticed this gentleman on the other side of the room got up from his seat and came over and sat right next to me. And not only was he sitting next to me, he was like leaning in, like he wanted to talk to me. And I turned around and looked, and it was an old friend, someone that I'd known all my life, Mr. James Pulliam from Bolivar, Tennessee. Mr. Pulliam originally had lived in Middleton, and he had known my parents and my grandparents practically all of his life. He shared some stories with me that day in that doctor's office that I just had never heard, and I was intrigued by all the new information. So I decided to drive out to Bolivar one day and have a chat with Mr. Pulliam and get some of these stories on video.
I didn't have any money. Well, $100 was a lot of money. So I went down to the bank and borrowed $100 from Mr. Simpson. And he said, "How long you want it for?" I said, "For 30 days. So when the 30 days came around, I didn't have $100. But I went back up there and I went in the bank and I told Mr. Simpson that I did not have $100 and I couldn't pay him. He said, "I didn't even know you owed me." He said, "Go on, pay me when you want to." So when I got the money, I got $100 and I carried it down there to him and paid him. He didn't charge me any interest. $100 and $100 got, and see he wanted business to stay and he wanted that money to stay for what little came in through the dry clean. He wanted that to stay in Middleton. He was a Middleton man.
I think before there was a Chamber of Commerce, there was my grandfather. He wanted to do anything that he could to help put Middleton on the map. One thing that my grandfather knew that Middleton really needed during those days was a hardware store. He was very instrumental in twisting the arm of Mr. James P. Shelley of Henderson, Tennessee, to come to Middleton and open a hardware store.
Mr. Lester Simpson, Mr. Neely came up there, and they knew Dad had been a good businessman, and we had the cotton gin at Roger Springs too, and so they want him to come down here and take this gin over in Middleton. And Dad said, "Well, I don't think so." Said, "You know, this has kind of been my dream." And says, "We're happy here." And said, "I don't think I'll be interested." But they got up there one afternoon, and I know it was 9 or 10 o'clock before they left. And I remember coming in, they were sitting there on the porch, and Dad said he finally told them, says, "Well, I'll come down there and look." So he came down here and looked, and sure enough, he bought the gin. And he told Mr. Lester, said, "Well, you know, I'll have to have a store. I've always had a store." And he said, "Well, I've got a building up here that Jack and Gene Whitey were in it, and I think they were looking for a job in Tennessee Gas." So he said they'd like to get rid of that, and said, "You can go in there."
He was a fair man. He was honest. His word was his bond. He was a man of integrity. He would never think of taking advantage of anyone.
I was in the bank one morning, and Jim Pulse came in. Jim was a farmer out a few miles from town, and his wife was sick, and he had to carry her to Memphis for surgery. Jim came in crying, and Mr. Simpson said, "Jim, what's wrong?" He said, "Mr. Simpson, I've got to take my wife to Memphis for surgery," and said, "I don't have any money." And Mr. Simpson reached over on the counter and tossed a checkbook to him and said, "Jim, you take this checkbook with you to Memphis, and when you pay the doctor, when the doctor gives you a charge, you write him a check for it. And when the hospital gives you a charge, you pay the hospital. You come back to Middleton, and when your wife gets better and she gets mending, you come back up here and we'll talk about how we've settled it." Wow. Now that was the kind of person he was.
My grandfather was also very political back in those days. He was a big D Democrat, and one of his good friends just happened to be then Governor Gordon Browning. The story is relayed by my father that when Highway 125 was being built, at least the new road coming through town approaching the railroad tracks, that my grandfather went out and made measurements and realized that the highway was actually 1 foot over from where it was supposed to be, that was actually encroaching into the bank's property. My grandfather took his concerns to the highway engineer on that project, and he wouldn't have anything to do with my grandfather. He thought it was crazy. So Lester went into the bank and he called up his good friend who just happened to be sitting in the governor's office at that time. And Governor Browning said, "Put that highway engineer on the telephone." So my grandfather went outside and got the building engineer, or the highway engineer, to come in and put him on the phone with Governor Browning. And he told that highway engineer, "Wherever Lester Simpson tells you to put that road, that's where you darn well better put it."
And he had a nephew that was in jail in the penitentiary in Nashville. And he knew Dad was somewhat of a politician. And he asked him if he could do anything to get him out of prison. And Dad said, "Well, I don't know, but I'll try." So Dad went to Nashville, talked to the governor about it, Governor Browning, and they got him paroled on the basis that he had never set foot in Tennessee again. So the next time he went to Texas, he went by the restaurant, went by to eat, and the old man said, "Mr. Simpson," says, "how much I owe you for getting that boy out of the penitentiary?" Granddaddy said, "You don't owe me a thing in the world." He said, "Oh yeah." I said, "You've been out your expenses going to Nashville and this, that, and the other," and said, "I want to pay you." And Granddaddy said, "No," said something like that, said, "Money won't buy it." Said, "That's friendship."
How about that?
A lot of people don't even realize this, but his wife, my grandmother, Ruth Webb Simpson, worked at the Bank of Middleton for over 25 years and never took a paycheck.
Goodness, Miss Ruth was, she was just a queen. You go to the bank, and of course she was one of the tellers, and she kept up with all of the people. If there was any sickness, she knew about it. We didn't have the advantage of having ambulances and things. Well, if you got sick, well, go down there to Miss Ruth and take them to the doctor, take them to the hospital.
The Bank of Middleton is well known for its bank robberies back in the 1940s and 50s. Those bank robberies usually turned out to be something more on the lines of gunfight at the OK Corral, because in such a small town, word would spread very quickly that the bank was being robbed, and the townspeople would lie in wait, if you will, outside the bank. And as the robbers would exit the bank, the guns, the rifles, the shotguns, they started firing.
And we'd come home a lot of times on Sunday night after church, and he'd call us and he'd say, "Hey, Pulliam, come over, bring your family over here. I'm cutting a watermelon." Now, Mr. Simpson, when someone would bring a load of watermelons to town and come by the bank and say, "Mr. Simpson, I have some watermelons out here," he'd go look at them. He'd tell them, unload them on my back porch." He wouldn't just buy one or two. He'd buy a wagon load of watermelons, and he shared them with the community. That's the way it was.
When my grandfather died in July of 1959, rather than go to the funeral home over in Bolivar to have visitation where there was no air conditioning, they actually held the viewing and the wake at the Bank of Middleton.
We couldn't imagine Middleton without Mr. Simpson. And it was, yeah. It was a very, it just disrupted the entire town.
We knew he died on the 4th of July, and we knew it was going to be hot and there wouldn't be enough air conditioning. And so when they got Granddaddy ready, we brought him here in the bank. We moved these 2 desks out, put them next to the wall back there, and we put his casket right here where these cabinets are, and banked this whole thing here with flowers. And the bank stayed open 24 hours. And all the people that wanted to come and visit, they could come to the bank anytime during the night of July the 4th, 1959. And the next day, we got ready for the funeral. We carried him up to First Baptist Church for his funeral. And I left the bank open until after we carried him to the cemetery and buried him. I came back and locked up the bank. That was very, very unusual, but it was a wonderful place here to have him lie in state, because this had been his life for 37.5 years.
I hope you've enjoyed this story of my grandfather, Lester Simpson. I have other stories coming. You won't want to miss them.
Got it. Brenda's girl called over the office there one day, and I caught the phone. She said, Mike, is that there Tim Simpson? Is he still flying an airplane? Said, I think he done chopped the top out of Granddaddy's corn. Just the way she said it, I thought I was gonna die laughing. He done chopped the top out of Granddaddy's corn.